welcome. Good afternoon or good morning, depending which part of the country you're in. This is the third session in the curriculum for guiding managing the academic biomedical core facilities. As with last week, I've got the pleasure of having my colleague Chris Richards that's going to be co-presenting this with me. We're going to do it pretty much similar to the last session that we had. So just to make sure advance of this that people know that this whole thing will be on the website that's listed here. I give you an example of the current website on the right. As you can see, the previous session, both the recording and the slides are available there. So please feel free, and this session will be accordingly updated once we've completed it, so the information will be there. And again, in terms of communications, I've had quite a few people contact me actually in response to this curriculum, and so I'm always happy to either correspond by email, or if you want a one-on-one discussion by Zoom or a group discussion, I'd be very happy to do that as well. As I mentioned, we're going to do this, we modified it a little last session to try and get a little more interaction and also not have the boredom of listening to me all the time, of which we are going to give it where we've got designated spots to promote discussion. And we obviously love it if you want to raise your hand, and then we can let you in and actually ask you a question in person. Or there is the chat function, obviously, that's available also. And as I mentioned, my colleague Chris Richards is with me. He's going to be moderating the discussion, so he can certainly read the chat function, and is very happy to provoke a little bit of conversation. Chris is very experienced with this. As you can see, he's the director of our light microscopy core here at the University of Kentucky. So we split this curriculum into 5 sessions, of which we had a general session in the initial venue, and then we split this into 4 sessions, of which we are now on to session 2, which is carrying elements 3 and 4. So this is the enhanced data management and service core use. So we split it into 2 elements. The first one is managing information, data quality, and availability. And the 4th element that we're going to talk about, which is the second one today, is what I think is, in my experience, fairly ubiquitous discussion of is how can we make people aware and enhance our user base. So for element 3, about this managing information, data quality, and availability, I think cores are becoming much more than just a lab that people do things with. I think an institutional core, should be managed in a mode that provides data that is highly regarded with respect to rigor and reproducibility. And as is mentioned in the initial presentation, I think cores actually have a great ability to not only provide this great service in terms of getting data and disseminating it, but actually being quite a focus of institutional stability in terms of data quality. Some of the things we talked about, and again, all this curriculum is a very active discussion because frankly, it's hard to know a single entity that would cover everything. We had talked within our internal group about the importance of developing SOPs and performing practices that are consistent with good research practice. We also talked about the importance of verification of instrumentation, document of reagents, and the data extraction, storage, and the authenticity of that. So to step through some of these, certainly the SOPs are probably the thing that I'll be emphasizing quite a bit. We actually do have a good research practice group here, which we have overseeing all our SOPs. So I'm certainly, hopefully, not trying to say that we're perfect by any means, but some of the things we've tried, and bluntly, as we're putting this course together, some of the things we've realized we could do better is that the need to really develop standard operating procedures that first off we've realized they need to be accessible. We had quite a bit of feedback that, and this will be one of the issues we talked about, the fact that we've tried to make our website fairly uniform in their distribution of information, so that every website is at least disseminating information in a certain way. And we've also talked about the fact that this again, a core is kind of a unique opportunity maybe to reach a broader audience, to make sure that good research practices are actually integrated into the training and the thought of way things are set up. Again, we've tried to make sure these are sort of central in the terms of the way that we present the data. So I would be happy to see what other people do in terms of that have got setups like this. We've again tried to think of ways that people would actually recognize that SOPs are there and then perform these good practices. We've set up a SharePoint site, for which this is one example in our rodent behavior core, of which we have each of the SOPs into a folder. I can tell you we've got some people who are wildly enthusiastic about SharePoints and some people who are wildly antagonistic about it. So it's kind of hard to know what forum will necessarily succeed in all of these areas. But we in general, now that we're probably a few years down the road, we at least seem to have got some acceptance that this seems to be a legitimate way of actually disseminating this information. We have, been quite aware that this whole kick-up of SOPs and performing things with standard practice is really probably going to take a little bit of a different level across all academic settings, especially with this recent NOT that NIH is now encouraging the use of the ARRIVE Essential 10 checklist in all publications reporting on the results of vertebrate animal and cephaloid research. So I know that doesn't include every core, but probably a lot of cores do have some elements that are incorporated within this. So I see this as a prelude to the way that NIH will roll this out as a requirement. Some of you may know that NIH brought some indexes of rigor and reproducibility in 2014, and then kind of had them percolating for a few years, especially through the journal system, and basically made them a requirement to some elements of their NIH applications. So I think certainly this type of thought is helpful for everyone to know about, and say cores being a sort of a central dissemination focus could be very useful in this. For those of you not familiar with this is more related to people with cores related to animal research. But the ARRIVE guidelines have been in evolution for a while. This is the most recent acquisition, which, as you can see, is very actively viewed. I'd love to have manuscripts viewed that many times, and very heavily cited as well. These were originally a European of origin, but they've kind of disseminated a little further. Basically, in their early manifestations, were extremely extensive, frankly, probably way beyond practicality. But now they've been distilled, and they've been distilled into these essential 10, of which this is what the NIH is really focusing on in terms of trying to make sure that any research that's done, and I'll say I would hold a core would be exemplary for this, can really help to be compliant with these ARRIVE guidelines. So I would encourage you to look at this website, and certainly again, this would be a discussion point both at this session and if anyone would like to follow up. But just to put it into a different light, the essential 10 here are these study designs, which as a prelude to this, a lot of this does mean that in essence, that maybe this is setting up a core to not just be a place where people either run in, use an instrument, or run in, dump samples, and then ask them to be done. But there is a lot more thoughtful discussion ahead of even getting to that stage of using the instrument. And again, I realized that we've got a whole spectrum of cores represented here. So for some cores, this is maybe not needed. For other cores, it would be very useful. It does, of course, rely on the fact that either the institute has to take a stance, I guess, that they think that this is so important that they will require a core or help a core to do this, and subsequently help, presumably, with the financial aspects of that, or that you know, a core has a consultation service. And again, I'd love to hear some people's viewpoint on this, but I do know that we have had to try and, or we've tried to implement some consultation services, and it's been a little awkward because obviously in an academic or sort of more of a free-ranging type of an environment, people just expect to come into office and talk to people. And you know, this obviously has a little more of a formal structure where it does rely on people walking into an office and then maybe have a timer started. But in our experience, as we've talked through these, you know, some of them are not necessarily related to cores maybe, but you know, at least cores can provide examples of what appropriate sample sizes would be. You know, certainly in terms of now we're expected in this world to have prospective inclusion-exclusion, just like the clinical world has had to do for years. And you know, that might mean the validity of data from the core, for example, as to, you know, what you'd expect to be there. Certainly randomization and blinding are most decent journals now are requesting that process. And that can mean the animals, but also obviously it could extend to the way the analysis is done within a core, and maybe the benefit of having that randomization done. And then some of these other issues, again, it can partly depend on the type of core and the need, but certainly some of the cores that do, for example, omic analysis, in our experience, there's quite a bit of different opinions as to what appropriate statistical methods are. And a lot of people, of the users, probably don't really know the pros and cons of this type of nuance of what type of statistical method to use. So again, there are many areas where cores can really be, I think, almost a required institutional resource to be able to roll these issues out. And you know, this has actually been formally put into publication in this paper that was in eLife relatively recently, you know, in which they sort of noted that, you know, service cores really can sell themselves as being this nidus for promoting rigor and reproducibility through good research practice. And it's you know, to some extent institutionally, I'm hoping institutes kind of recognize this really is a potential strong point of these, you know, facilities to be able to really manage this type of aspect of what is important. Those of you who've been involved in any institutional discussion of rigor and reproducibility know it's a very difficult topic to roll out, and then to have people sufficient experience to really roll it out in a productive way. But again, I would hold that cores have a kind of a unique area here to be able to push this out. So, you know, that's I think one area where cores can shine to have SOPs. I think there's bluntly rather limited number of academic institutes that have this, and as I say, since this is not uncommon in cores, and frankly, probably the way it should be is kind of helpful. I also get a lot of feedback about the way that instrument performance is evaluated in a core versus, you know, what they're done in sort of set labs environments. You know, some of these can be very routine. I mean, I think in terms of pipette calibration, when I've talked at general forums on this in lab settings, and then asked the question about have anyone done something as rudimentary as a pipette calibration, I would hold that I'm not sure whether the percentage is going to be very high, is the bottom line. And you know, that is certainly something that's really kind of fundamental, because obviously it can vary over time. And any error in pipettes and variance between your pipettes can be, just one very simple example of a very simple instrument that could deviate quite badly in terms of the rigor and reproducibility. We also have had lots of discussion about actual scales, although in my experience, these do not tend to be so much these days. But again, most clinical-based labs will require such attention to this very routine equipment. And probably in general, cores, again, are probably the best place to make sure people realize that when you use equipment in a core, it actually has a lot of validation process behind it. We have, for the more specialized instrumentation as well, clearly there is performance standards that are expected of some specialized equipment. And certainly sometimes it's some instruments, can hold specified performance better than others. Again, we haven't succeeded in our own self across all cores, but we have on some cores managed to get the these standard protocols which have a standard nomenclature and standard setup, so that people hopefully will have confidence that when they come to the core, they can both reference a document that will demonstrate the way that this equipment is being validated, plus there will be reference information and documentation to demonstrate that the processes that have been done in the SOPs have actually been facilitated and carried out. I guess the third element that of a lot of what's coming through here is documentation of reagents. And I think there's many reasons to do this, but certainly as a former editor, journals are increasingly require the full documentation of reagents. And that includes both the catalog numbers and in many cases the batch numbers. So some just examples that we've run into both in my lab in different areas. For example, those of you involved in animal research or animal facilities, the nuance of different foods can make a huge difference to the outcome of a study. So certainly not knowing which food is a detriment. Also in my colleagues in the nutraceutical area have certainly educated me the fact that a lot of these foods, obviously from natural products, the constituents are almost impossible to be incredibly uniform from month to month, throughout the year. And so again, a lot of my colleagues in the nutraceutical world actually do analysis of each food. So there's some things you can't do anything about other than you can document it. Bedding is an example where it might sound trivial. In my own experience, I've been involved in studies where in anti-inflammatory processes, certain bedding had a massive effect on the inflammatory status of the animals that they were serving. So it could actually be quite a provoking factor. I think, the two of the areas that probably come for the most discussion are probably antibodies, which happen in both, many cores actually, but I just listed the pathology and the flow cytometry. Clearly antibodies, well, if they're from hybridomas, you'd hope that they would be consistent from batch to batch. Quite a few companies will evolve non-hybridoma type antibodies that can vary quite considerably from batch to batch. And while most of the high-level companies do a lot of quality control, they don't always do a lot of quality control across every single species that may be engaged in your core. So we, again, are trying to get a process out there where once a study is performed within a core, the users have the ability to be able to, achieve a mode of acquiring all the information that's now kind of a requirement for the journals. Many of the journals now are requiring these, like the metabolism journals are requiring these STAR methods, and it is now becoming, almost a pretty routine thing to issue this. And in terms of the authenticity of reagents that we have to write as a section in our NIH grants, I think it's now becoming a fairly standard term to say that everything that's been used will be, documented in catalog numbers and batch numbers. So I think this is just an area that we have to move into, is the bottom line. And then I guess the last part of this was about the data that's generated during this time. And again, I'd be interested to see what people's feedback is, because this probably is the one that we've had the most issues with in terms of making sure there's appropriate expectations of the users and the core. Because certainly in our case, we try and emphasize that all primary data generated in the core needs a transfer mode to faculty members, whatever the faculty members' preferred storage system is. And that's because we emphasize that it's not the responsibility, it is the responsibility of the faculty member to store the primary data, not the service core. We try and, get over that. Of course, there's always this communication issue of how to do that. Certainly, we're trying to have an SOP that clearly states the responsibility of data storage. And we are trying to emphasize that at the time of training, that you as a person acquiring data in a core, you can't expect the core to maintain that data forever. I think if you're at an NIH level of anyone questioning your data, the data grouping, should we say, would not expect a core necessary to maintain data. Having said that, in our case, we've decided it's very helpful to make sure that we have an SOP that clearly defines that we can have a reference material to state that we've made this. So we've ended up with this sort of standard process and procedure in terms of the way that we present these SOPs. They, as I say, they do go through a formal review by a good research practice grouping, so that there is sort of a standard nomenclature, standardized labeling. But for this particular issue, we have stated that all original third-party associated files should be removed from, in this case, the rodent behavior core within 30 days. And we do have a variable assistance being on the size of files. These files in this particular core don't tend to be quite so big. And so we have an institutional commitment to support lab archives, which hasn't got a vast ability to store big files, but it is a ubiquitous access for people who want to store data there. So we've really tried to emphasize over and over again that the core cannot be held responsible for lost data down the road. It is really the core is responsible for making sure that it does provide a mode of transferring data, but that it's not the source of long-term storage of data. So we've come to the area where we have questions if anyone want them. So Chris and I were chit-chatting about this in terms of we realize we can say things, but then there's a practicality of implementing things, and then probably the bigger issue is the practicality of the users actually complying with the wishes of the way that the core has been put together. So Chris and I, these are just a couple of the questions we thought about, because we have had some, should we say, belligerent users in the past that do not seem to think it's their responsibility to actually retain data, and have been a little resistant to this. I don't know whether anyone else has experienced this, and sort of what the level of conversation and the level of persuasion. And then, at some point, I'm not sure we do this, but we've never just deleted. Maybe that's a little harsh way of stating this, but certainly after putting an email out there or putting some mode of communication, at some point you have to do something often, because especially with these incredibly large databases of some of these cores, things just have to be moved off what is the centralized service. So I don't know whether anyone else has any comments about the way that well, what we've just gone through in terms of both the standardization, whether they've had problems implementing it, and whether people have been resistant to it, whether people are resistant to core management.
I don't see anything in the chat. I would say in our core, we have a policy on our user agreement that everyone signed that users need to remove the data. We've had a couple of, as Alan would say, belligerent users. Most of the people that don't remove their data, though, are just lackadaisical about it. And in fact, what ends up happening is we simply hunt people down, remind them, badger them until they come. So we've never, even though it's in our documentation that after 30 days or some set period of time, we can delete the data. In fact, we've never done that just because we've had people come back 6 months later asking where their data is. So I'd be curious to know what other people have had for an experience in this area. You can even throw it in the chat if you want, and I'll do my best to read it.
I can tell you we had one non-institutional core that the director left, and we just got subsequently inundated with requests for data. And between the fact that there was no centralization or process, there was no server set up in this core. The computers have been moved around. It seemingly it presented a nightmare. So we think we're trying to serve our users by advising them on this. Don't know whether they take it that way, but that's what we're trying to sell it as.
In the chat, Chrissy mentions that typically their response is to send an email with a reminder with what's described as a generous expiration date, with often a link to a storage or a shared drive as a storage location. And then Wendy indicates they haven't had that problem at all in the energy balance core. People want their data right away. So they've been archiving some of the data. And typically in light microscopy, some of the data files are monstrous, and we have users that will take the data, but they don't delete the data when they take it. They kind of use us as a backup storage facility, in essence. The other thing that I was wondering if anybody was actually currently using the Arrive guidelines and how they felt about them, whether they felt they were straightforward and easy to implement, or if it was more problematic.
Actually, just Kevin just put something in that I would agree with this, that we have had instances where, let's say the lab structure is such that it's been residing with someone other than the faculty member, who was a little surprised once they come to put something together that maybe it moved the postdoc or the grad student. And, so it probably does require the core helping to educate faculty sometimes about having a data storage management system as well.
I think Michael has a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we've taken something of the opposite approach with regard to data storage. I run two cores, actually, an MRI core. So we produce lots of really large data sets. And then another core, the mandate of which is to facilitate research across a number of areas revolving mostly around brain science, broadly defined. So we've been, for the last number of years, developing and deploying a neuroinformatics system where we can push data directly from the scanner to this neuroinformatics system that has controlled access, automatic project assignment, that sort of thing. And we're in the process of expanding its utility beyond MRI data to EEG data, behavioral data, eye tracking data, other types of data, with the idea that people can use it. It's not really designed to be an archive per se, but it attaches to automatically run pipelines, for example, where users can automatically download their data in formats that are standardized and required by a number of open archiving systems like OpenNeuro and that sort of thing, to try to make it easy for people to have these large boluses of data and to manage them and to put them wherever it is that they're going to do their work in a standardized way, and to automatically connect with a number of pipelines, some of which we've helped develop and others of which we have just implemented that other people have developed. So I just want to put out there that there's another model as well. Rather than just say we want to get rid of the data as quickly as possible, we've taken the approach that we want to at least curate a space for your data to go through and make it as easy as possible for you to get the data wherever it is you need it and be able to do whatever it is you want to do with it.
So Michael, does that mean Brown has made a heavy investment in that system, or is it an expensive system that you've got?
So we're using something called XNAT, which is an open source tool. I mean, we've made a heavy investment in the sense that it's mostly developed and funded through an IGMS research core attached to one of our COBRIs. So we're in the process now of transitioning from a phase 2 to a phase 3. Knock wood, we're still waiting for the final word on the phase 3. So that's been the primary driver of that. Although the lines between the MRI core and the behavior and neuroimaging core, which is this other core that's been responsible for that development, are a little blurry on purpose. So some de facto investment on the part of the university, but it's not like the provost is opening his wallet and showering us with cash to do it.
Yeah, that's a rare event, I think, at any institute. Yeah, I think part of our discussion was that it is something that does need financial investment, and whether it's easier to push that to other places in the university. I mean, someone's got to do it, is the bottom line. I mean, I think maybe more the overriding thing is to have a definitive mechanism for data management that's well listed. Is there anything else, Chris?
Nope, I think we've covered everything in the chat.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess the second element we're going to do is really trying to increase awareness, and again, this may be a little institutional specific, and a lot of what I'm going to say is pretty obvious, I think, but it is amazing how many times I go to forums and say, we've got this core or this instrument in the core, and I get total blank looks, even though we feel like we've done quite a bit to try and advertise them. I mean, so a communication plan, increases the awareness of services, and basically that's to increase the awareness both inside the facilities and outside. And part of the reason that, again, we'd love to have a chit chat about this at the end with people engaged in this process. But, it's great to say we can do all this stuff, but everything you do does involve some commitment of time and often some commitment of financial resources. So it is a case of, you've got to implement what you can implement and then decide whether some of the other things that are maybe beyond the standard, how useful they are. I mean, I think reputation probably is the most obvious way to get the word out there. I mean, clearly, if people do know that you've got this really great place, that really helps. So, probably the most effective mode is to enhance the user base to develop a stellar reputation of being a core that's of helpful and expert staff, using really high functional technology that provides support to facilitate research productivity. This again is very easy to say, but it does mean a lot of issues like awareness and so for example, in Chris's case, having beautiful images that come out and people are aware of, and knowing that they can get them because the core has these level of both instrumentation and expert advice to it. So the more we sort of probed into this as to where to do, probably reputation is probably the biggest overriding issue. In terms of websites, my guess is you probably all got websites. Again, these are things that can take, they don't just pop up. I just put two examples of Michigan's beautiful website and our really boring website here. I guess the bottom line, at least we've been trying to think of, is at least have a resource, and then when people go to these, try to make them as standardized as possible. And again, it sounds like a simple mantra, but we've found that even within a single domain of the institutional cores, getting everything in place, actually took some time. We think we're somewhat there at the moment. Obviously we're trying to make sure that these are also the reference source for all information. And in our case, we do use these as the potential portal for all bookings. So at the top of each of our cores, we put these quick links, and there is a mode there where it takes us to our facilities management software to actually book it. It is a case of whether the content of this really drives much. So for example, we do have a research publicity, research publicity office here, and they've put together some of these cutesy little videos on some of our, in this case, our microscopes, the multiphoton and the AFM, using these little YouTube loaded movies. We talked a lot about the effort put into these and whether it's worth it. And, I guess it is to be seen. They are there and they're listed. Of course, depending on what type of data your core grabs, you can get it out there. Certainly microscopy quite often is a very nice way of putting out beautiful images to enhance content. But as you know, websites, content will only drive traffic if it's fully consistently updated and is of such that it will attract an audience. And I think we've tried to put enhanced content on here, but it does revolve some time and effort. We do have newsletters that come out centrally, and so for example, this is one example that just came out in this issue where every month our central research, the vice president's office, sends out, which we try and have some information on the core facility. And, for example, this is one where our flow and immune monitoring core got an IsoSpark, and we were trying to advertise the IsoSpark. I think although we try and do this on a very routine basis, our realistic assessment of this is that it has a very, very low impact, even though we try and do it. Fortunately, this is pretty low effort as well. We have thought about a lot about different institutional advertising. In our own case, for example, we got a micro CT recently, and this actually wasn't based on the core. This was based on one of the users put a poster in the corridor, and it was actually surprising how many people looked at it and then came over and started asking us about this micro CT, and actually ended up being users. That frankly was not planned at all. And also it just so happens that this board happens to be right at the entrance of the main entrance of one of our major research facilities. So not only there's this serendipitous in its content, but also serendipitous in its location. We do have screens around some of our newer buildings around. And again, we've had some of our cores spend quite a bit of time and effort putting presentations together that they could put on here. this can be quite a bit of, it's not money, but it's quite a bit of effort, and it may help a little bit, but it's not quite so clear. And then we've tried many other things, and it'd be interesting to hear what other people have tried and whether they think can succeed. But we at one point had a seminar series that were mostly on the cores. That was reasonably successful, and obviously it tends to be a little bit patchy on. People tend to come when the specific interest is theirs, and they're probably users anyway. So if the intent is to expand, it probably more educates the existing users, which has some use, rather than expanding the use. We certainly have had very little social media usage. We have heard that some cores do that. If any of you are on that have used it, I'd be interested to hear whether you think, again, it is someone's got to take the time to do it, whether it's an effective way of doing it. We did have one core co-director actually participate in graduate teaching, and in some ways this was very helpful for making awareness, because obviously we were presenting graduate students right at the base level of training with an indication of the diversity of equipment that we had, and how to use it. And we're kind of hoping they maybe educate their faculty, especially if their faculty are not so juniors, say more set in their ways. But this did require that we commit a member of the core to actually teaching a program, so actually developing the course and teaching the course, and that is quite a bit of time and effort. We have done a lot of departmental visits, so especially those departments that have research days, for example. We've offered to drop by and give short presentations, and I think they've actually been they're rather sporadic, but have been kind of helpful in terms of getting people to think about what can be available, and have quite often, because the research days, there can be a bit more of an informal discussion. We've not done facility tours very much, but it's been a discussion, especially when there's new equipment, or facility opening houses. We've done this quite a bit, obviously, for incoming faculty, but frankly, quite a few of these facilities have enjoyed doing this, so there has been some benefit. This hasn't been such a big deal. And then we have had quite a bit of discussion about trying to do a lot more awareness, that maybe one of the things that could be done is that a faculty coming in, part of their awareness issues could be to help them actually link their startup packages to some core usages, so by giving some voucher system to be able to do this. This is done in very different ways in different places, and startup packages are so random in the way they're developed. It's a little hard to know, give you very standard advice on this, but we have been trying to think about, certainly in our own institute, maybe thinking of ways that we could both help the incoming faculty and help the cause by sort of using this as an opportunity to make sure they're aware of what's available. So anyway, as I did as a prelude here, the bottom line, it is challenging to have campus-wide awareness of the full extent of core services and equipment, and certainly our experience would be that it's very unclear that there's any single mode of increasing awareness. It's just even within social media, for example, there's such a fractionation of different modes of social media. So it's not just a single entity. It's if you wanted to do that, you have to think about what would be most effective for your particular user base. And all modes of advertising, as I mentioned at the onset, do take some time and effort. So it's not as if this can be just briefly done. And then in terms of external users, I've just got one slide that again, in my experience, a lot of the external use tends to be because of the networking of the core personnel, which tends to be the major driving force. A lot of people, the external users we've had here, some of it has been purely geographical, because we have had some companies that just had to have something set up that happened to be in town and we're convenient. But I would say, at least in our experience, most of the external users have been very familiar with the people that have been approaching them from the outside world, either whether that be an academic external user or an industrial user. And we have had a few people saying that they picked up on one of our cores through a web or a sort of random web search. I guess it does emphasize the fact that having websites stay contemporary and up to date is potentially important on the option that an outside user might actually be expressing interest. So again, I think this is all pretty obvious stuff, but in our case, it's we get users and institutional officials sort of saying, why aren't we doing more? There always seems to be a need to do more to make sure everyone knows about it, but it is kind of tough. So again, Chris and I, we have a question section here, and we just put a few in here about, what have you found any specific magic wands to be effective at your own institute? And, do you actually engage in social media? Do you find that to be effective, or to engage in any other activities?
So there is one question in the core specifically about asking for advice on how to increase awareness for laboratory animal facilities. So if anybody has experience with doing that type of marketing, anything that's been successful, we'd be happy to discuss it. Or feel free to put it in the chat too.
Yeah, I would say that has been the one where I've sort of got feedback that we have to be careful in the way that we advertise it, because obviously what I showed you, like the screen displays, they're done by some of our central research ad services, and clearly, I don't know whether it was in this thing, it's right next to our Starbucks, that particular one. They want things to be very tasteful, and obviously they want things to be non-controversial. So I would say that has been probably the core that's been a little more of a challenge than any others. I think in terms of straight husbandry for animal cores, that's usually not such an, at least in our hands, not such an issue, because at least in our case, we have a centralized unit. So if you're going to do animal research, you kind of have to go through them. But what has become a little more difficult is that, for example, we offer services to do breeding and documentation of colony management, which I think most people do probably not very systematically. And this is a way of doing it with an experienced person and having a web-based documentation system for all the offspring. We think it could be a really useful thing to advertise, and that's one where it's been a little difficult knowing how to advertise a service like that, even though we think it would be a massive institutional benefit for people to be aware that we probably have a service to manage their colonies way more effective than they're doing by themselves.
I manage an animal core facility. The way we do it is we've have done previously like a series of hands-on training for grad students and postdocs, just like husbandry, different type of injections or blood drawing collection, just to get them used to it. If you are training a postdoc or a grad student, just to get them hand-on, it gives faculty members more curious to do an animal work. The other thing I do, depending on, but at least once a year, I do lectures on colony management, and then that has been helpful. So we have a standardized way that we do breeding. So I do lecturing, and then whoever comes, and then we usually have a quite number of people who do come.
So you get enthusiasm for colony management, it sounds like, for education on it.
Yeah, just for educational purposes. So anybody can come, not necessarily just for the current users. Anybody can come. But yeah, it requires a lot of time from your part to investment.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, as I say, colony management, I think, is one area where let's say, being more efficient, I think would help tremendously. And, now there are softwares out there which, like many things, it might take a little bit of a learning curve to get into it. But I think once you get into it, it's so much easier to disseminate.
One thing, following up on something Alan said earlier, I was curious if anyone had found it more effective to market to grad students versus professional research staff versus PIs. Like where do you get the biggest response, and I guess the biggest return on your investment of time? I think in our case, we've primarily focused on faculty going to talk to centers when they're having a meeting, or going to speak at a faculty meeting for a specific department. And we've had mixed results where sometimes it seems we gain no traction, particularly with the faculty meetings, and we've had better success when talking to kind of a focus center that all has the same research theme. But we've debated this ourselves, whether we should actually be talking to grad students, because they're the ones that are going to come into the core.
Yeah, bluntly, one of the situations we've noticed is, we try and make sure the core has really good equipment and top level, but it is a charge structure. And then, some of the departments and centers have equipment that's maybe not such high quality, but is maybe kind of serviceable, and their faculty sometimes are, let's say, willing to have access to that, but not so enthusiastic about, getting access to a much better piece of equipment and acquire much better data. So that's where it's helped us a little bit appealing to our more early career people, is them recognizing the options and recognizing and being able to convey that sometimes the core just has equipment that can get much better, higher quality data.
So Wendy makes the point that it's not been very effective to present posters at a poster session at program research days. And essentially, it's not something that our core has tried, but it seems like that's something I would have predicted would be effective, but apparently not so much.
Well, looks like everyone's agreeing with Wendy. So, so Chris, I would rethink your strategy then.
Yeah.
All right, well, it's getting close to the top of the hour. So thank you for your engagement on this one. As I mentioned, we arbitrarily split this up into 5 sessions, of which today was the data management. On May 15th, this will talk about fiscal management. This will be a little more nuts and bolts. I mean, the 2 areas will be developing rate structures and fiscal management. Just as a prelude to this, I think one of the things that NIGMS has been concerned about is the sustainability of cores, especially those that start off with different mechanisms that don't need rate structures. And I think this is a thing that they've would really like us to hone down on, about the mechanisms and the practicalities of doing rate structures. So we will be in May 15th, so about just over 4 weeks, doing a relatively deep dive into ways to develop rate structures. And in the interim, if anyone has any feedback about what they've done for rate structures, we'd really appreciate it, because again, we've done this long enough to know that there's no real uniformity of the way that people think about it. And where we might be presenting our perspective, it'd be really helpful to get everyone else's perspective. So as I mentioned before, all these recordings and slides will be available on this website. And again, feel free to contact me by email, or we can have a follow-up discussion. So unless there's, okay, some other things came in, just, I guess Chris was talking there.
Yeah, there was some discussion about whether it's useful to have some type of a core user group seminar, or in our case, I mean, we've done seminars where we invite an outside speaker that seems to have a lot of interest among our users. So we haven't specifically done a user group seminar. But I do think it's an interesting idea. I think Michael brings up the key point. If you have lunch, you'll pack the room. If you don't have lunch, it's hit or miss. And I think that's been universal for us. When we have lunch, it's always packed.
Yep. I guess you've always got to make the decision though, whether people are coming for the lunch or for the seminar. All right. So last comment. Oh, it's Chris itself. Well, I appreciate everyone's attendance today, and as I say, hopefully we'll see many of you back here on May 15th to talk about, a much more sort of nuts and bolts topic of fiscal management. So I appreciate everyone's interactions and participation, and hope to see you in a few weeks' time. Thank you.